Hi, today we are officially starting our courses, and the first one is about Plato. Plato, the philosopher in ancient Greek theory. Plato's The Republic is a Socratic dialogue that deals with the questions of justice, the just city-state, and the just man. It is Plato's best-known work and one of the most influential works in the history of political thought. It consists of 10 books and chapters, and especially the book 2 is important in our discussion as it deals with the question of why be just. There are different characters in the book, and let's start identifying them. The first one is Socrates. Socrates is the main speaker, a philosopher who leads his audience and dialogue partners to conclusions by carefully structured questions. Sometimes Socrates' verbal agility makes it difficult to see that he is avoiding answering the question he is asked and is instead addressing something else entirely in his responses. Socrates strongly influenced Plato. In the Republic, Socrates is usually acting as Plato's stand-in. The other character is Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is a sophist or professional tutor and philosopher. Thrasymachus is the only real opposition to Socrates in the dialogue. Thrasymachus believes firmly that justice is to the advantage of the stronger. Sophists as a group tended to emphasize personal benefit as more important than moral issues of right and wrong. And Thrasymachus does as well. Thrasymachus' depiction in Republic is unfavorable in the extreme. He appears conceited, given to boasts and bluster, and his frustration with Socrates and Socrates' method of approaching knowledge through questioning is evident. He leaves at the end of Book 1, but his exit suggests he is frustrated and is aware that he has not successfully debated Socrates. Although the choice of name may be inspired by the historical sophist Thrasymachus, the name literally means schemer. The other character is Glaucon. Glaucon is Plato's brother, and he walks with Socrates to the Piraeus and participates in the entire debate. Glaucon questions Socrates carefully and is interested in determining what justice truly means and what defines the good life. Adeimantus is another character. Adeimantus is one of Plato's brothers. At first, he doesn't agree that justice is better than injustice, but Socrates succeeds in convincing him. The other character in the dialogue is Hesiod. Hesiod is a Greek poet who probably lived during the 700 BC era. His works included tales about the creation of the world according to Greek mythology, and a number of stories about the gods that show them in an unfavorable light. Because Hesiod's poems are imitative and imaginative, Socrates would censor his works in his ideal city for both moral and stylistic reasons. Another character in the chapter in the book 2 is Homer. Homer is a Greek poet. The Greek poet Homer believed to have written the Iliad and Odyssey, two of the greatest works of Greek literature and of literature in general. Socrates objects to parts of Homer's works for moral reasons, since the gods are not always shown behaving morally or even believably. And also we have the city-state in the chapter or in the book 2. The just city is a larger version of the just man with the three social classes that are producers, the auxiliaries and guardians, working together as the three parts of the soul work together in the just man. Two key concepts for the city are the emphasis on specialization, so that each person is trained for a particular occupation, and the emphasis on education, which encourages specialization and trains the guardians and the philosopher king to properly rule. The ultimate failure of the city is tied to the failure of the education system. When someone whose aptitudes and nature are not suited to being a guardian is selected in childhood and educated as a guardian. There are some excerpts from the book, and let me briefly read and explain them. First one, justice belongs in the finest kind. Justice seems to belong to the form of drudgery, which should be practiced for the sake of wages and the reputation that comes from opinion. But all by itself it should be fled from something as hard. For I desire to hear what each and what power it has all alone by itself when it is in the soul, dismissing its wages and its consequences. Now listen to what I said I was going to tell first, what justice is and where it came from. They say that doing injustice is naturally good and suffering injustice bad, but that the bad in suffering injustice far exceeds the good in doing it, so that when they do injustice to one another and suffer it and taste of both, it seems profitable to those who are not able to escape the one and choose the other, to set down a compact among themselves, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. And from where they began to set down their own laws and compacts, and to name what the law commands lawful and just. And this then is the genesis of being of justice. It is a mean between what is best, doing injustice without paying the penalty, and what is worst, suffering injustice without being able to avenge oneself. The just is in the middle between these two, cared for not because it is good, but because it's honored due to a want of a vigor in doing injustice. And yet, someone could say that this is a great proof that no one is willingly just, but only when compelled to do so. Men do not take it to be a good for them in private, since wherever it supposes he can do injustice, he does it. For the extreme of injustice is to seem to be just when one is not. So the perfectly unjust man must be given the most perfect injustice, and nothing must be taken away. He must be allowed to do the great injustices while having provided himself with the greatest reputation for justice. Therefore, since as the wise men make plain to me, the seeming overpowers even the truth and is the master of happiness, one must surely turn wholly to it. Then, by what further argument could we choose before the great injustice? Well then, I said, a city, as I believe, comes into being because each of us isn't self-sufficient but is in need of much. So then, when one man takes on another for one need and another for another need, and since many things are needed, many men gather in one settlement as partners and helpers. So this common settlement we give the name city, don't we? After these excerpts from the book, from the dialogue, we can summarize the book as follows. Glaucon asked Socrates whether justice belongs first in the class of good things we choose to have for themselves, like joy, or second, those we value for their consequences, though they themselves are hard, like physical training, or third, the things we value for themselves and their consequences, like knowledge. Socrates says justice is in the third and best group, Glaucon says that most people would say justice is valued not for itself but for its consequences, for justice is difficult and thus often avoided. We can analyze this statement as follows. Remember that Glaucon wants to be convinced, and he says that justice is a virtue and that it is valued for itself as much as for its consequences. He is merely playing devil's advocate here. Glaucon reviews Thrasymachus' arguments about justice. First, it is generally agreed that to do injustice is naturally good, but to suffer it bad. Consequently, men make laws, and what the laws require they call just. The origin of justice is a compromise between right and wrong. This is justice as a social contract, an agreement between people to avoid being unjust to each other, so they may avoid being the victims of other people's injustice. People value justice because they lack the power to do injustice. Justice is practiced only by compulsion and for the good of others, since injustice is more rewarding than justice. Human nature inclines us towards injustice, but the law forces us to behave justly. Justice lies in following the laws, whatever they may be. Glaucon tells the story of Gyges' ring here. A shepherd discovers a ring that makes its wearer invisible. The shepherd uses the ring to seduce the queen, murder the king, and take the throne. If the power to do injustice were given to those who are usually too powerless to practice injustice, then, like the shepherd with the ring, they would be as unjust as others. Through the history of Gyges' ring, Glaucon contradicts the idea that laws equal justice. He argues that if a person could get away with injustice, as the shepherd does, he would behave unjustly. Glaucon's brother Adeimantus says that it's merely the appearance of justice that is praised. An unjust person who has a reputation for justice leads a life of pleasure. The gods perceive truth and punish the unjust, but gods can be persuaded by prayers and sacrifices purchased by the unjust who have profited from their crimes and pleasures as well. Here, the appearance of justice is seen as enough even for the gods, since they may be placated by other means. Glaucon asked Socrates to describe what justice and injustice each do in themselves, how justice benefits those who have justice, and how injustice harms them. Glaucon and Adeimantus want Socrates to describe the pure qualities of justice and injustice. Socrates proposes first to examine the justice of the city, because it is easier to determine what is just for the group than for the individual. He begins by specifying what the ideal city, Gallipolis, needs. Socrates is proposing to argue from the general, the justice of the city or group, to the particular, the concept of justice and the individual. A city needs people, food, shelter, and goods, with each person specializing in a particular occupation. The city needs merchants to trade with other cities, a marketplace, currency, local trailers, and people who perform manual labor for a wage. Luxury goods and services require a larger city, which leads to a war to acquire more land. War requires an army, and soldiers require special skills. One of the most important aspects of the city is the idea that each individual specializes in a particular occupation. Socrates examines the requirements of soldiers or guardians. A guardian needs to be gentle to his own people, but harsh to others. Therefore, the guardian must be a lover of learning, a philosopher, educated from childhood in music and poetry, then given physical training. Notice that already Socrates emphasizes the importance of education and philosophy. Poets like Hesiod and Homer, for instance, tell inappropriate stories about gods committing impious actions, stories which might influence the citizens to act badly. Therefore, the city must only use stories depicting good behavior so as to influence the citizens of the city in positive ways. Socrates and hence Socrates' puppet master Plato have very specific ideas about the function of literature to teach and the importance of censorship. To summarize the book 2, which is quite important in the context of why be just, we can say that there are two kinds of political justice. The justice belonging to a city or state, and the individual, the justice of a particular man. Since a city is bigger than a man, he will proceed upon the assumption that it is easier to first look for justice at the political level and later inquire as to whether there is any analogous virtue to be found in the individual. To locate political justice, he will build up a perfectly just city from scratch and see where and when justice enters in.